Stop me if this sounds familiar. Christians are judgmental hypocrites, people who want others to feel bad about their lives, but who are secretly doing or wish they were doing everything that they criticize, and their walk doesn't match their talk. Now, if you've heard that or thought that before, you're not alone. There are a lot of people out there who think like that. And in fact, in a survey of thousands of people and many interviews, two authors, David Kinnaman and Gabe Lyons, describe how many people, especially folks in their 20s, feel about the church today. And what they found in their surveys is that 9 out of 10 people in their 20s reported that they believe Christians are judgmental. So that's 9 out of 10 say Christians are judgmental. And about that same percentage, around 9 out of 10 again, believe Christians are hypocritical. And according to these folks, the verdict is clear. These folks that they surveyed, Christians are a bunch of judgmental hypocrites. Now, one woman that they interviewed was named Lisa, and she told her story about how at one point she had gone to join some women down the street in a local neighborhood church, and they were doing a Bible study together. And she shared how a friend of hers was pregnant, up against a wall and between a rock and a hard place, and was considering having an abortion. And she reports that when she told them about this, that the other women kind of changed their tone and started talking at her and trying to convince her that her friend shouldn't get the abortion, rather than being empathetic and listening to where her friend was at and what was leading her to that point. They didn't try to understand her point of view. And what Lisa revealed in this survey, in this interview, is that she herself had had an abortion years earlier, and what she was really looking for was not just empathy for her friend, but for herself. And we've all heard these sorts of stories together. We've probably all been there, we've seen it, we've experienced it, maybe we've been the ones to do it. Sometimes the shoe fits a little too well, and I've got to be honest, my name is Brad, and I am a judgmental hypocrite. In fact, I was going to call this sermon Judgmental Hypocrites, but my wife told me I maybe need to tone it down a little bit. And at the same time that I recognize that story and I hear people say that kind of thing and I see my own heart and know where I'm coming from, I recognize I mess up. I also recognize the vision of life that Jesus taught and lived and showed as being something much more beautiful and attractive than that. And a lot of us are probably judgmental hypocrites, but I'm convinced that Jesus wasn't. And I'm convinced that he wants something more for us. And here's what I think we got to do. I think it's precisely what Jesus taught in Luke chapter 6. And I think what we've got to do is learn to look at our own lives before we look at the lives of others. Okay, so let's study what Jesus said in Luke chapter 6. And if you've got your Bibles open, we're going to walk right through this. So verse 37, talking about looking at our own lives, here's Jesus teaching, and he says, look at this, verse 37, do not judge, follow the verbs, and you will not be judged. Do not condemn, and you will not be condemned. Look at the next one, forgive, and you will be forgiven. And we'll pause there for a second. So notice what he says. Don't judge, don't condemn, forgive. We should just say that together. Don't judge, don't condemn, forgive. That is enough for a lifetime, if you ask me. Don't judge, don't condemn, forgive. If we try to practice that every day, I think we'd go a long way towards living what Jesus taught. I think that's right up there with the golden rule. Treat others as you would like them to treat you. So don't judge, don't condemn, forgive. Now here's what I think Jesus means by that. Judging and condemning really go together. I'm not sure where judging ends and condemning begins. They're really two sides of the same coin. And what he's saying is, don't place yourself in the place of God as judge. Don't write somebody off. But what Jesus is not saying, and what he doesn't mean, is that we should never be willing to make a decision, make a judgment about what is right and what is wrong. He's not saying that there is no right and wrong, because there is real right and real wrong, and as the people of God, we have to be able to tell the difference. And I think that this is one of those things that you kind of grow into, especially as you're watching others, the saints among us, and watch how they handle life, that you grow into these kinds of habits of knowing right and wrong, but not coming down on people as if you're better than them. And we pick it up. It's something that it's caught rather than taught. I know in one family, one of the kids is in the habit of looking at mom and dad and saying, "Do we do that? Do we do this, what they're doing, or don't we?" Right? It's the thing that you catch. You kind of figure out how to do it. And what Jesus is not saying is that we aren't supposed to be able to identify bad behavior, that we can't be clear that certain stuff can't happen, certain behavior has to stop. He's not saying that we can't challenge someone when they're doing the wrong thing, especially in the life of the church. He's not saying that everything goes. I think especially when we are charged with protecting or training, that especially when we are talking about our life together in the church, then we have to be able to clearly say, this is right, this is wrong, and if someone's doing something they shouldn't, you have to be able to say, you can't continue in what you're doing. But I think that's something different than judging. And you see Jesus exercising this role all the time. He confronts the Pharisees. He says, look, you put rules that are too hard to follow on other people, and then you don't even follow them. He confronts those money changers in the temples. They're abusing God's people in the system of sacrifice. He flips those tables right over. He confronts people who think that violence is going to be the answer to everything. He says, no, you need to go the second mile. He says, no, you need to turn the other cheek. But the reality is that what he's doing and what I think he calls us to is not judging. Far from it. It's something different. I think what he calls us to is the work of discernment. And there's a great difference between discernment and judging. Discernment's good. In the ancient church, discernment was considered the queen of the virtues. And discernment simply means being able to perceive the difference between right and wrong. It's a function of wisdom. And so discernment is what someone does when they recognize that something's not right in a situation. Discernment is what happens when someone says, I'm going to tell the truth even though there's lies all around me. Discernment is that moral compass. Discernment is what happens when we recognize the plank in our own eye. Now we got to have discernment. This is what Jesus was getting at when he said, let anyone with ears listen. It's when he said the eye is the lamp of the body. That's what he was getting at. When he said, stay awake, for you know not when the day or the hour that the Son of Man will come. That's all discernment, paying attention to what's right and what's wrong. And let me give you an example. If you know some of the stories in the Old Testament, you'll remember the story of the prophet Nathan and King David. And you remember that David is a king after God's own heart, someone who deeply loves God and wants to follow God with his whole heart, but he messes up, like all of us do, and he commits adultery with Bathsheba. Well, David kind of thinks like he's gotten away with that until the prophet Nathan comes to David and he tells him a story. He says, hey, king, think about this. How would you feel if there was a man who had just one little sheep, and it was his favorite sheep, and he took care of the sheep like a pet and fed it like a pet? And there was another man who was rich and had many sheep. And when that other man threw a party, instead of using one of his sheep as the main course, he went and took this one sheep from the poor man. How would you feel, king? And David, rightly so, is infuriated because he's a man after God's own heart. He recognizes that is wrong. And he says, that man deserves to die. And that's the moment when Nathan brings it all home. He says, that's you. You are the one. That's what you have done to Uriah. You have taken his precious wife from him and taken his own life. And that's when David just, his guilt washes over him. He recognizes that he is the one in the wrong. It's discernment. But what makes it not judgment is that then Nathan says in 2 Samuel 12:13, David says, I have sinned against the Lord. And Nathan replies, yes, but the Lord has forgiven you. You won't die for this sin. Nathan doesn't write him off. Nathan doesn't say, you're a good-for-nothing king. I don't want to hear anything from you. You're just a lousy sinner. Nathan stays in there with him and says, you have sought the Lord and he has forgiven you. And this is the thing, that it's not writing people off. It's not beginning from a place of superiority. And discernment, in fact, begins with ourselves. Discernment is recognizing that all of us have weak spots, that there are places where we have to be careful. And this is what makes discernment so different from judging and condemning. Because when we judge or condemn someone, what we're doing is putting ourselves at a higher level. Okay? What we're doing is acting like the Pharisee who in Jesus' story, I don't know if you remember this story, but Jesus tells a little story at another place in Luke chapter 18. He says there was a Pharisee and a tax collector, and the tax collector gets up and prays and says, Lord, have mercy. And the Pharisee gets up and prays and he says, Lord, thank you, I'm not like that guy, right? Thank you, I'm not like other people, those rogues and thieves. Thank you that I am a good man. That is judgment. But discernment's very different. Discernment begins in our own heart and recognizes, wait a minute, I have these places where I am messed up. And you see, when we judge people, or when we condemn people, we're putting ourselves above them, we're putting them down, we're reducing their humanity, and that's what makes it wrong. We're saying, I think you're beyond the pale. I think you're hopeless. Ultimately, what we're saying is, you're not as worthy of God's love as I am. And the danger of that attitude, of judging and condemning, is that it's writing people off. And I don't think God ever writes anyone off. Now look, there are going to be times when we have to get away from people because of how they're acting. They can be dangerous to us emotionally or spiritually or physically. But God does not give up on them. God doesn't write people off, and neither should we. And I think it all comes down to what Jesus teaches here in verse 36, which is the verse right above our passage. Look at verse 36. Be merciful just as your Father is merciful. That's what it comes down to. This attitude of mercy. Can we be merciful as our Father is merciful? And you know, this year at West Zion, we've been celebrating the year of mercy, and mercy is really our guiding light for this whole year. Can we live in mercy? Can we make mercy central to our Christian walk? And I've seen this done. You know, I think it's possible to disagree with someone sharply, strongly. It's possible to even challenge someone. It's possible even to be angry with someone, though you don't want to let that anger take over, and still be merciful and not write someone else off. I think part of it requires us to have an attitude of forgiveness. Jesus says, that don't judge, don't condemn, forgive. I think it's also verse 38 where he says that the measure you give is the measure you're going to get. We've got to recognize that we make a lot of excuses for ourselves, right? But we're often harsh with others. What standard do you want people to judge you by? Then look at others with that same standard. So think about this with me. How do you want people to judge you? Use that same standard. How do you want people to judge you? I want people to see my best intentions. I want people to remember my successes, not my mistakes. I want people to see the good in me, not the bad. So shouldn't I do the same for others? And a judgmental spirit is a deadly thing. So many of us carry around on our backs a stock of weaponized judgmentalism. And part of what makes it deadly is that source of the judgmental spirit. Judgment comes from pride, the sense that we are better than the person we're judging. And pride is a deadly sin. Some would even call it the root sin. But Jesus will have none of it. Look at verse 39. He tells them a parable. Can a blind man lead a blind man? Will they not both fall into a pit? You think you're better. We think we're better. But we're all just as blind. Verse 40. A student is not above his teacher, but everyone who is fully trained will be like his teacher. The most we can hope for is to become like our teacher, Jesus. And he didn't have a judgmental bone in his body. Now, the Apostle Paul talks about this in his letter to the Romans. He says in Romans 12:3, "Don't think of yourselves as higher than you are." He said instead of measuring up our accomplishments of faith, we should just measure ourselves by the gift of faith, rather than some sense of entitlement or accomplishment. And in fact, this theme is running throughout his whole letter to the church in Rome. I mean, so much about Romans is all about who's in or who's out. I mean, who has the gift of salvation, the Jews or the Gentiles? And Paul comes down to it in Romans 3:23, where he says really clearly, all have sinned and fallen short of the glory of God. In other words, all of us are in need of God's grace. None of us are in a position to judge others. And this is why Paul wrote to the Philippians, and he said, "Be humble, thinking of others is better than yourself." And if we look at what Jesus says, he teaches that we're going to have to give up on trying to judge others, and instead, we're going to have to start looking at our own hearts. We're going to have to start using discernment. And unlike judgment, discernment comes from love. 41 and 42. "Why do you look at the speck of sawdust in your brother's eye and pay no attention to the plank in your own eye? How can you say to your brother, 'Brother, let me take the speck out of your eye,' when you fail to see the plank in your own eye?" In other words, don't worry about that other guy's speck. Start with your plank. So this is the question: where's your plank? And the thing that's so funny and so ironic is that most of the time we don't even know we have a plank. I mean, most of the time, if you're anything like me, you're thinking, plank? What plank? I see specks all around, right? But I don't see any plank in my eye. I mean, what's your blind spot? And the problem is that it is a blind spot. If it weren't a blind spot, we'd see it. It's kind of like traffic accidents, right? If you can see the other guy coming, then you don't run into him. Once when we were younger, my brother was driving on a road close to our house, and someone made a left turn right in front of him, and he T-boned their car, and everybody came out okay, if a little shaken up. And the lady, when the police showed up and did their whole duty, the police asked her what happened, and she said, "I didn't see him." And that's the thing. Somehow she didn't see him. She had this blind spot. She couldn't see him coming. And this is life. We have these blind spots. We don't see things coming. And if we could see more clearly when we're at our weakest, then we wouldn't get ourselves into bad situations. And the problem is that a lot of our blind spots are tailor-made for us. And we kind of trick ourselves into thinking that it's not that bad, or maybe even it's kind of good. It becomes like this question that we sometimes get asked at interviews. Maybe you've been in an interview and had this question asked, where they say, "What's your greatest weakness?" And you always got to turn that on its head, right? And you say, "Well, my greatest weakness is that I work too hard," right? Sometimes it's true, but we try to turn it into something good. But the real plank in our eye is not going to be the kind of thing that we want to say to other people. It's going to be the thing that we lie about even to ourselves. And you wouldn't want to say it in an interview, right? So kind of imagine this. You go to an interview and they say, "What's your greatest weakness?" And then you imagine saying, "Well, I try to make myself look better than I really am." Or, "My greatest weakness is that I put others down, at least in my own head." Or, "My greatest weakness is that I'm a judgmental hypocrite." We wouldn't say those things. And often we wouldn't say them because we don't even recognize them within us. I think it's a little like Samson in the Old Testament. If you remember that story, Samson, he has this mighty strength from God to be able to accomplish God's mission and lead God's people. And Samson, he gets in a fight with the family of his wife, and so he goes and he burns the whole grain fields of the Philistines. That's the plank in his eye, is anger, this furious anger. Or Samson's always chasing these Philistine women, one right after the other. The plank in his eye is lust. And then Samson thinks that no one can ever stop him because of his God-given strength. And it turns out that the plank in his eye is pride. He can't see it. And eventually that plank leads to him being captured and chained to the pillars of the temple of this foreign god. Eventually that plank in his eye leads to literal blindness. So where's your plank? What's your blind spot? Don't bother trying to pick the speck out of your neighbor's eye. You've got a plank in your own eye. We all do. When we go after that speck rather than the plank, we inevitably become judgmental hypocrites, which is what Jesus said in verse 42b. You hypocrite. First take the plank out of your eye, and then you will see clearly to remove the speck from your brother's eye. First take out the plank, then you can think about the speck. And this is where we start to see where judgment's very different from discernment. Judgment starts with the other guy, with all that's wrong with the other person. Discernment starts with ourselves. So how do we get the plank out of our eye? Well, 3 things. If you're taking notes, this would be a place. First, I think we learn humility. We've got to recognize our own weakness. We have to recognize that we are all sinners. This is one of the great things about praying the prayer that Jesus taught every day, the Our Father, which is something that over the last decade I've really been doing. Pray the Our Father, pray the Lord's Prayer every day, because right at the heart of it is this petition that God forgive us our sins or our debts or our trespasses just as we forgive others. It keeps our own need for forgiveness right in front of us. And I find that I am getting better at recognizing that I am a sinner the older that I get. Now that I have some really juicy sins under my belt, I can kind of be a little more compassionate about others when I see the trouble that they get themselves into. I think we learn to be more gentle with others after we realize how easily we stumble. 2, spend time in prayer. The gift of discernment comes from God. And, take what the Apostle Paul says in 1 Corinthians chapter 12. There's the gift of healing, the gift of wisdom, the gift of knowledge, the gift of discernment of spirits. And he says they all come from one source, which is the Holy Spirit. And I think that the way we learn to become discerning is through God's Spirit working within us over time and giving us that kind of wisdom. 3, get someone who can help you. We need people in our lives that we can be transparent with, that we can share our failings with, people who aren't going to tear us down. This may be a spouse. This may be a good friend. Could be a trusted spiritual advisor. It needs to be someone who can hear without judging, preferably someone who's a little farther along on the journey than you are. And I think this is one of the great things of the discipleship groups that we put into practice last year. 3 people get together and they regularly help each other on their spiritual journey. It's a little bit like young Samuel in the Old Testament. Samuel has been given over to Eli to help him out in the shrine at Shiloh. And Samuel hears the voice of God at night, Samuel, Samuel. But he has to go to Eli and have Eli tell him what he's hearing, have Eli confirm for him what is going on. And Eli says to him, that's God. And when you hear him again say, speak, Lord, I'm your servant, I'm listening. So we have to have people like Eli who can be in our lives and guide us along the journey and say, that's God. Pay attention to that. I think one of the greatest tragedies of our age is that we think that everyone's equally capable when it comes to spiritual things. So many people are completely unwilling to submit to any kind of guidance. That smacks too much of organized religion, right? There's like a lot of pushback against organized religion. I don't need anybody but myself. But the reality is that without the guidance of others, we're walking blind and we'll go right into that pit. So where's your plank? Because it's only when, by God's grace, we start to recognize what that plank is, that we can begin to see the world in a different way, to see others differently, to see ourselves differently. My name is Brad, and I am a sinner saved by God's grace. Amen.